NAFA's webinar on transaction integrity. Today, we've got a great panel talking about tips for avoiding and dealing with bad actors in aircraft transactions. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors of today's event, TVPX and Holland and Knight. This wouldn't be possible without your support. Throughout the event, there's an opportunity to post questions on the chat, so please do so. These webinars are set up to be somewhat interactive, conversational. We want everybody to learn something about transaction integrity and potential fraud for transactions. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. Our moderator is Shelley Sforn, CEO of Infinite Branches. We're also joined by Zipporah Marmor, VP of Aircraft Transactions at ACAS, and Jonathan Epstein, partner at Holland and Knight. So thank you for your participation. With that, Shelley, I'll hand it over to you and go backstage.
Well, David, and everyone who's joining us today, and particularly my amazing panelists, we're grateful that you're here. We're grateful that you're curious and you want to learn more and have the opportunity to share what you hear and how we can improve what we do in our industry. What I'd like to say too, this was such a great opportunity to have a financier, an aircraft broker, and an attorney walk into a webinar to discuss this with you. And while this may sound like the beginning of a joke, it certainly isn't. It's something that we all take very seriously. Zipporah, Jonathan, we had amazing conversations preparing for this discussion, and we want to feed off of the previous of this three-part series, which was built intentionally upon the true tactics in aviation transactions, what you should know. The next panel on May 17th will be focused on how to conduct KYC. So what we're really here focused on today is to speak about the practical activities using your friends in the industry who come with a wealth of knowledge. This is about community. This is about collaboration. It's about recognizing that NAFA is not just one group of people. It's a series of people who come with a variety of different perspectives. Approximately 30% are financiers, approximately 20% are brokers, and approximately 20% are attorneys. And you'll hear different perspectives today. And together, we will have an opportunity to grow. And on that note, why does know your customer due diligence matter? What does it mean to you? And some of the issues that we really should address are preserving your brand integrity, protecting your clients, protecting an industry that is under scrutiny, and avoiding government investigations. Jonathan, when we spoke in some of our preparations, you broke out a number of items that were very specific that we should pay attention to. But some of the ones that we don't necessarily always talk about that we should be talking about include reputational harm, the cost and time in responding to inquiries, and even voiding the transactions. Share more on this, on these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a hokey truism that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And, you know, the pound of cost and expense and lost sleep when you're the target, you know, I'll just say back in that right corner, if you get a subpoena, grand jury subpoena, or you get a subpoena from, you know, the Treasury Department or Congress or Homeland Security, that makes for a really bad day. And not only that day, but even if you didn't do anything wrong, I mean, the costs of doing that sort of forensic audit and producing documents to the government can be enormous, take away time, and cost you in audit fees and legal fees. So that's just sort of one, and they do happen. They happen all the time. The possibility of avoiding transactions, we can talk about a little later, but I just, if you do a transaction with a sanctioned person, for example, or there is a let me just give you a good example. Some sanctioned Russian oligarch, sells his aircraft to or transfers aircraft to some entity that then your client buys. Well, OFAC would say all of those transactions are void. And so you as the buyer may not own that aircraft, or it may be subject to seizure. And I've got some examples later of how those things work.
And let's talk more broadly about reputational harm. There's a saying that it takes an entire career to earn and build your reputation, in 5 seconds to destroy it.
Yeah, I mean, both in aviation, which is a small community, but or business aviation, which is a small community, but larger. For example, if you've been involved in an export violation or a sanctions violation, other counterparties, your bank may fire you. We've seen that where companies have had trouble because they've been seen as doing business in sanctioned countries. And amongst lawyers, amongst brokers, reputation is everything. When I ask for reputable brokers, I want somebody that's going to represent my client, the best they can. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan, for speaking about that. I want to continue to talk about reputational risk throughout this entire discussion. And it really is important to rely upon a community of people who you can trust. And that's why this series that NAFA is hosting is incredibly important. Get to know people in the community, work with them, build trust. I love this slide. It always makes me happy looking at that little boy. It just embodies what are the risks, and let's talk about some of these real world examples. Zipporah, when we spoke previously, you brought up some red flags to watch for as a broker. Sometimes you are the first person to speak to the client in any transaction. And we talked about, if something doesn't feel right, put your hand up. And let's talk about some of the things that you have had to put your hand up and slow down a deal.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shelley. And thank you, NAFA, for having me here, and everybody for participating. Very happy to be here. As you said, brokers are often the first people in touch with the actual end buyers, the actual clients. And it's important that we do our own due diligence, that we don't only rely on the banks if they're using financing or the attorneys, et cetera, but that we have our own KYC and our own experience and sniff tests to proceed. So what I think our sales team here is sick of me saying this, but I will not submit an offer if I don't know who the end user is, who is the UBO. And I might not know him by name at a certain point because they're using a broker or somebody else that is reputable. So they might not be able to disclose that information, but I need to know he's based in the US and works in the auto industry, or based in Switzerland and owns a factory producing widgets. I need to have some concrete knowledge of who the ultimate UBO is. Even before we get to a real deal, it's, for me, important, and I think for our industry, to do that at the LOI stage before we even get really engaged. If that question is too difficult to answer at an offer stage, that is absolutely a red flag for me.
There was another issue that you spoke about too that I thought was really fascinating, is if a potential buyer or seller is a little too quick to negotiate, how does that make you feel?
And you put it on the slide here very accurately. If it seems too good to be true, it's usually too good to be true. If we send a template offer to a party and it comes back with just a signature on it, with no changes to any of the terms, nor any questions, nor even the title and full written name of who signed it, these are all red flags. If a purchase agreement is sent out and it comes back barely negotiated, there is a reason for that. Most people do read this or have people who go through purchase agreements for them. So too little comments, too little interaction in the deal, too high a price. If they come back at ask price, that's a red flag. If they want to skip steps of a transaction, and especially during the kind of boom years in the middle of COVID and all of that, when deals were being accelerated rapidly, we still found that the tried and true steps to getting a deal done are important to be followed. And that's skipping step. Let's go right to APA. Let's not do a visual. Let's do, going against the typical order is a red flag, is something to be mindful of, and does not save time in the end. It often just gets you in hot water.
Well said. And I think it sums up some of the points that we've made here. Use your head.
And your heart sometimes. After some of us have been doing this longer than we care to admit, it also becomes, if you have a feeling that something is not right, you need to explore that. Don't sweep things under the rug. Encourage your younger people, your younger sales directors or attorneys or financiers to ask questions, to raise their hand if something doesn't feel right or smell right to them. We need to encourage that as a culture within our companies. And I know that we've certainly done that here at ACAS, that everybody's open for questions and comments and feedback. And we need to make sure to maintain that kind of atmosphere.
I was just going to add, as a Navy man, I like to tell sea stories, but I once, as to your first point about end-of-life aircraft, I once had a Homeland Security special agent say to me, every Gulfstream G2 and G3 that's going south of the border is going to be used by a drug smuggler. Like, that was his view. And, so if you're selling these sort of older sub-$1 million aircraft that are, south of the border, you need to be doing your diligence on who the ultimate, end user is going to be. Similarly, the last point, if you've gone through 2 escrow agents who've said, we're just not interested in doing this deal, and you don't know why, that's a red flag. Or if a trustee or a bank has sort of walked away, something worth investigating.
Jonathan, we've talked a little bit about sanction risk, and I'd really appreciate you breaking down some of these issues regarding the U.S. government sanctions. What's happening now, particularly with some of the recent legislation that's passed?
Yeah, well, I mean, the recent legislation, it just increases the risk factor. Is that in the Ukraine-Israel funding bill that went through Congress, a week or so ago, there were a number of additional sanctions provisions, including an increase of the statute of limitations for violations under certain statutes from 5 years to 10 years. So, it's an interesting legal question, but, if you had a violation, 8 or 7 years ago, you're potentially at risk.
Any one deal is not worth that kind of risk. That's what we spoke about, Jonathan, Shelley, a lot in our prep calls, that think broader than one deal, because one bad deal can haunt you for many years, as you just said.
Yeah, and we're not going to go into the details of all the sanctions and export control laws, but one of the reasons why we're harping on this ultimate beneficial owner issue is that if an entity is out there and it is, so that the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control has sanctioned thousands of individuals and entities in Russia and Venezuela, for drug smuggling in various South American countries, in other countries. But that list is not all inclusive, because any entity that's 50% or more owned or otherwise controlled by that blocked entity is considered property of that blocked entity. So you have, I'm going to give you very real examples of, aircraft that are owned in through these various structures, but everyone knows who the beneficial owner is, and those aircraft aren't going anywhere because they're essentially frozen because nobody can do business with the owner. Russia has made things very difficult, I would say, because you have not only do you have these sanctions on Russian oligarchs, you've got this task force, klepto capture task force seeking to identify and stop, identify Russian assets, and you also have these complex ownership restrictions. And not to take too much time, but in preparing for this, there's yesterday, the Department of Justice announced that they were seizing a landing gear for a 737, starting forfeiture procedures on a landing gear in Miami. And it's a really, just to run through the facts really fast, because it could happen to us in our industry too, is that a Part 145 repair station in Florida was selling landing gear to this foreign company. The foreign company was designated a SDN, was sanctioned for, providing goods and services to Russia. And so what did the company in the foreign country do is they said, oh, no, switch the purchase agreement to this other company. And they cleared out all the references to the prior company. Well, all the facts are not clear, but Customs seized this. Well, Customs seized this a year ago. And yesterday, Customs filed their forfeiture action. So it's been a year, and I don't know who owns that landing gear, but somebody's out $1.5 million worth of landing gear, and it's going to take a long time to see what happens to that. So that's the type of issue that can come up, and I guess one of the lessons learned is, in the same way when I'm doing an aircraft transaction, I ask the escrow agent to you don't even have to ask. They'll rerun the searches, the lien searches the day of. Rerun the OFAC search the day of or the day before, because this happens. I mean, it happens. And the other piece is sort of the 2020 hindsight is that, the government's going to say, gee, you, the seller, you should have known. There was an article out there, or there was this, this was published that this entity was a sanctioned entity. Why didn't you should have known? And my guess is that will be an issue in the forfeiture action.
It goes to show, as you said, hindsight's always 2020. So double check, triple check, make sure you know what you need to know about every transaction you enter into, and don't take anything for granted. Some of the red flags that are out there. Zipporah, we've talked about so many things over the past couple of prep sessions, but one thing that really stood out was where back-to-back transactions are these days. Some of the red flags and sanction risk, but you specifically spoke to back-to-back transactions, and I was utterly amazed by what you had to say in a good way. So please say more.
Well, we like to refer to them as buy-sell transactions. And in my view, and the view, as a former chair of IATA and very much involved in the broker community, buy-sell transactions or back-to-back are not inherently bad. There are cases where they are necessary, they are accepted by the seller and by the buyer, and it's a proper way to do a deal. What differentiates that is disclosure. An undisclosed buy-sell in these days is a very difficult thing, especially when the seller, if it's going to a middle party and then ultimately being sold right thereafter, the seller can be responsible as well for the ultimate, where it's going ultimately after this. So it's important to know, it's important to have that KYC not only on the middle party, but on the end party. So that's what we strive to do. It needs to be disclosed. You need to know where all the funds are going to. That's really important in these days.
And Jonathan and Zipporah, when you are building those purchase agreements, how do you factor that knowledge, that clarity into these agreements so that everybody knows and has that expectation?
So, I mean, I wish I got involved earlier. Sometimes I'm involved at the LOI stage and I can ask that question. But, absolutely, before you sign any sort of binding agreement, you need to know, you should have some idea who the counterparties are. You may not have all of your diligence done, but certainly I usually put in a purchase agreement, a condition precedent that says the counterparty will have, disclosed, provided reasonable information to satisfy our know your customer. And if I've dealt with this in back-to-back situations where, the counterparty doesn't want to disclose, and we say, well, look, we've got confidentiality provisions in the purchase agreement, or we'll sign a separate non-disclosure, but we absolutely aren't going to do the deal until we know who the ultimate beneficial or the ultimate end user is and who owns that. And that's not just sort of KYC. When if you're exporting the aircraft from the United States, when you fill out your export declarations, your export paperwork, you have to put in the ultimate end user, not just the intermediary party who might be the broker buying the aircraft.
One of the things we talked about was that we have a bunch of red flags here that are serious red flags, but having a red flag doesn't necessarily mean the deal's dead. It just means you need to keep asking additional questions. And Zipporah, please chime in on that.
I'm nodding because that's true. And we've also, the question has been asked often, when do you know that you've done enough due diligence? When do you know that you've done enough KYC? You'll know when you know because you feel satisfied when you've reached the top of the hill or the bottom of the road or whatever euphemism you want to say. When you've gotten a satisfactory answer, and so you do the KYC until you have that satisfactory answer, until there's no more questions left to be asked.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to hear so many members of this community say, keep going, keep asking questions until you feel confident.
And ask each other. That's also the beauty of this community that we work within and the colleagues that we have. I'm very happy. I call TVPX all the time and ask, hey, what do you think about this or that or the other? Ask each other, ask within your organizations and ask outside your organizations if there's anything that you're not 100% comfortable with.
Yeah, could we on the red flags, I just wanted to stress, because the Russia sanction, what happened in March of 2022, you had an industry where there was a real shortage of used aircraft, and you had all these Russian corporate jets, some very large, very modern, that were flown to the UAE and other places and started to appear on the market. And whether you can do a deal with them or not, is sort of a factual inquiry. They're difficult deals. Some of them can be lawfully done, but like some of the red flags we have up here is under U.S. export laws, Gulfstream and Bombardier and Embraer can't support an aircraft that's owned or leased to a Russian person. So you had these aircraft, sitting basically non-maintained. So a red flag would be, well, gee, why isn't somebody maintaining this aircraft? Can you get over that? Maybe, possibly, and certainly we've been involved in those sort of transactions, but it does require a lot of diligence.
Absolutely, and I have plenty of stories about red flags that we were able to move beyond as a recovering banker. And something to talk about at a later date for sure. This slide encapsulates how I should go about conducting KYC due diligence, but the next event will really focus on how to really do that. This is up here for purposes of just keeping this in our thoughts at every single time. what I want to share too is a factual story that happened about really understanding the parties who are at the table, not just the ultimate beneficial owner. One of my mentees on my team at the bank where I used to work had asked me, should I conduct due diligence on this particular party? The client was not using an aircraft management company and instead was working with a pilot who was serving as their broker and who was going to also manage the aircraft. So this individual was doing quite a bit more than what one would normally see. And I said, do the due diligence on him. And lo and behold, what came back was something rather shocking. And it led us to halt the transaction. What we found was that this individual had been caught moving drugs across the country for a previous employer and had been able to get off due to a legal technicality. And so I would say to all of you who are working with clients who are not using a broker that you know of or using a management company that you know of, expand that research beyond just the UBO.
Yeah.
Conduct a simple Google search and it'll be very interesting what you find.
Yeah, I would say my one comment on this about conducting due diligence. A couple of years ago, I was at an OFAC conference. That's the Office of Foreign Assets Control that does all the sanctions enforcement. And the head of enforcement there she said, if you don't have contemporaneous written records that you did due diligence, you didn't do any due diligence. So I always use that in training to say, look, not only is it important to do the diligence, but in some fashion, whether, and they'll get into this in the next seminar, whether it's just saying, look, here's my search results, and I'm putting it in an email, or if there's something, in some hairy transactions, clients will hire us and we will do a whole due diligence, or they'll hire an investigation company so that you can put in the file that says, look, we did this. We didn't know. Will that get you? Is that 100% get out of jail free? It will keep you out of jail, but it does. There are some strict liability we can talk about, but having that due diligence and having documented it is so important.
It's incredibly important. That leads us to some of the common questions in know your customer due diligence that seem to come up repeatedly. If somebody else is conducting due diligence, do you really need to do your own due diligence? And Jonathan, we talked about that expecting other people to conduct due diligence is not a valid defense if questioned about it.
Although we wish it were sometimes,
Yeah, I agree. I think, if you hired a company to do, outsourced your due diligence and they prepared a memo for you, great. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking, and I've been on these calls too. It's like, well, this particular escrow agent, we know they do due diligence, so why should we? And my answer, one, is you should, because you got to document that you did your due diligence. But the other, to some of the earlier points, is you're looking for red flags, and the escrow agent or me as the lawyer, I'm not going to see what the broker sees, for example, or the technician who's, a commercial aviation example. Client comes to me and says, our technicians were going through the records on this leased aircraft, and there was an Iranian airline that did some maintenance work on this aircraft. Well, I would never have known. I would never have seen that, never even known to look for it. And it, obviously it had its own had certain implications, but everyone and the brokers are closer to the transaction. They're seeing who's showing up to actually review the records.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things that I think are important. That mean that would give you reason to do it yourself. Plus your own integrity, right? I don't want to be involved in a transaction that involves a sanctions violation or an export violation.
And I think just to add to that, it's important to request the information, but oftentimes to validate that information as well. So there was a case where, for example, a request was made to prove the financial capability to conclude a transaction, because obviously that's an important step for us. I'll put client in air quotes here, provided a bank letter saying that they had that many assets and he could conclude the transaction. And the letter was signed by two bank employees. And that information was then validated by calling the bank. And those two people had been employees of the bank, but were no longer employees of the bank. So you have to be very careful. You have to check and validate everything, and not only just take what you receive at face value, even if you are getting answers to your questions. Go the step further, make a phone call, send an email, validate what you're getting.
I think that brings us to the next topic of what are some of the money laundering and fraud risks in aircraft transactions. Zipporah, you hit that right on the head. You can trust, but you definitely have to verify.
Yes.
Jonathan, you had a great example of some of the fraud and hacking risks in the industry that have occurred.
Well, I had an aircraft leasing client that got spearphished on some vendors, and when they looked back at it, it was clear that somebody had just changed. The address was close, but somebody had gotten into their system and were watching the transactions. Who knows how they got in, and they were able to recover. But there was this case I found in doing training about this company out in Hong Kong that had taken over the leasing of some large commercial aircraft. And again, somebody got into their system, watched transactions for a long time, waited for a $5 million transaction, and then sent an invoice with a different payment instructions. And when the escrow agent calls you and says, I need to verify by phone these instructions, that's why. I mean, and I would say that, you think about the amount of money that gets handled in some of these transactions in individual wires. It's a target. And while in theory, like a big law firm, we've got all sorts of protections. We've got monitoring. It's harder to break into ours or into a bank's systems. An individual broker or somebody else, it may be easier to break in.
Yeah. And I think the list of attempted phishing attacks with both escrow agents, banks, and other places, we could fill multiple webinars.
Yes.
The lessons that we've learned, though, in all of this is pick up the phone, find out who you're speaking with. And I do hope that NAFA continues to focus on how AI is aiding some of the bad guys in trying to facilitate these types of hacking, because it is occurring in not just the aviation industry, but in other industries as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wanted to mention the other scam that I've seen recently in aviation, which is, and we're not really going to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act, but on the Treasury Department website, they talk about the scams where people are trying to get people to and I've seen these letters. They come from, in one case, it was from the United States Department of Records Management, an agency which doesn't exist, saying, here's this QR code, scan on it. And the goal was to get you to go and pay them money to do a filing that they weren't authorized to do. And they were going to take your money and run with it. So it could be a paper, something you get in the mail that just doesn't seem quite right.
Absolutely. And it's really important to make sure your entire team is aware of this, and any situations that don't feel right, that they feel confident enough to come to you and put their hand up and potentially stop a deal if that deal needs to be stopped. in the situation that I spoke about previously, it was a mentee. She was new to the organization, new to our team, and she was taking a big risk. And I told her, do it, put your hand up. We have to discuss this. And it led to stopping a transaction for us. And that took a lot of courage. Zipporah, you and I talked about this as well. How do you do this as a leader to make sure that people do trust their gut?
I think I'm fortunate to be at ACAS, where we're not only a broker, but we're also an aircraft management company. And as such, we have an SMS culture and the whole culture as an operator is built around, if you see something, say something, and reporting any potential incidents or whatever. So that transfers well over to the broker side, where it is a culture of if something feels a little shady, let's talk about it. It's not the deal at all costs. Whether the deal is going badly, whether it's going too well to be true, or even if it's just chugging along, we need to ask ourselves the questions. We need to, if you haven't met the people in person, if they're not going to a visual in person and they're sending some delegates who you don't exactly understand the connection. It's not a management company. It's not the wife. It's just somebody, or who's showing up to calls, to conference calls, to video calls. It's important to know who you're working with on the client side and also on the partner side. There's a comment in the section here that I saying, be nice to your escrow agent. We're doing our best for you. And I think that's very true. We need to know who we're working with and really build that bond.
Well said. And there was another word that I hope you share with everyone because I loved it.
It's an old Jewish Yiddish saying that my father would say, you have to feel it in your kishkas, which means in your guts, and just feel that it feels right.
Feel it in your kishkas. Hopefully I got that pronunciation right.
Very close.
Okay, we'll work on it. Goals. Just as long as I actually feel it before I can say it. And I like to say, always be curious, ABC. And there are things that you can see, but keep going until you get to the bottom. Some of these just seem so common sense, and don't overlook them and don't treat them as though you're checking a box. These are just very straightforward things that all of us can do that just take a little bit of time. Jonathan, one of the things that's down at the bottom but should never be forgotten is the last minute request for changes in payment details. And I'd love for you to talk about that, as well as urgent wire requests that come in.
Well, so I mean, this is, generally speaking, in the context of the sort of the spear phishing attack, which is, and I'm certainly not an expert of it, but it's where somebody infiltrates your system and then is monitoring and then creates documents to look like they're a legitimate party. And in some cases, they really do. They can do everything. In some cases, the address, the email address or the internet address is just slightly off. So, I mean, that's just a red flag. I mean, obviously, there might be legitimate reasons why there's a change. But the other, we didn't really talk about sort of true, money laundering, where, and there have been instances of this that have made the news in the U.S. where, you've got a lot of, fundamentally, one form of the main form of money laundering is, somebody, a drug dealer, somebody taking cash that was earned illegally and trying to clean it. So one way to do that is you create an aircraft transaction, you wire money to escrow, and then you say, well, this deal fell apart, but wire it back to this other entity of mine. Mm-hmm. And so you're moving the money from one account to another. And there might be a legitimate reason why that happens, but it could be that it's because the money was from an illegitimate, from a criminal activity. And so this would be a red flag to at least ask the question.
And as I like to say, always be curious. There's a reason for something happening.
We had a case recently where the seller, upon the buyer, excuse me, upon KYC, further KYC, the company name was actually the LLC that was buying the airplane, not the UBO, but the was very similar to an LLC name that had some red flags associated with it. That was causing concern. So instead of, we didn't sweep it under the rug, we had them sign a document stating that they were not that company, that it was in fact a different company, and just acknowledging that they were, few letters apart in name, but it was a bit too close for comfort. So it's just, it's important to go that extra step to make sure that you're asking the right questions and getting the right answers.
And I think it's really important to reiterate what your exposure is in any transaction if you get it wrong. And you may have seen this previously, but it's worth repeating. Jonathan, just the cost in time and money in responding to government investigations can take years.
Yeah, I mean, I recently, some of there were, and it slowed down, but a spate of arrests of aircraft for failure to make proper export declarations. In some of those cases, those aircraft were detained for a year. And I just told you about this landing gear where they held it for a year, and now they're starting the civil forfeiture action. What you want to be, well, you don't want to be in the situation in the first place. But if it happens, you want to be able to say, look, I did my diligence. Maybe they were able to dupe me, but I did reasonable diligence, and there was nothing, there was no way I could have known that 2 or 3 transactions later they intended to do something wrong with that aircraft or engine, and that. Does that get you 100% out of it? Certainly, in the U.S., to be criminally liable, you have to willfully engage and intentionally engage in the activity. In the civil penalty case, often the U.S. government will follow that same mantra, but they don't necessarily have to. So there is potentially strict liability if you did it. You engaged in the transaction with a sanctioned person. And I like to talk about, there was FedEx recently actually lost a case where, somebody was using Federal Express to illegally send, packages to Syria and other countries. And they were fined, not a big fine. And they said, well, look, we had this process, and the government won on the theory that, well, look, you aided and abetted. You didn't have to willfully aid and abet. You didn't have to knowingly aid and abet. You aided and abetted. So therefore, we can impose these civil penalties. As a practical matter, the cases I've handled, rarely would you see that. But they do reserve that right.
I'll share, when I was working for First Republic Bank many years ago, and this is well before the sanctions on the Russians came through in the manner that they are today, we had an individual who had just joined the bank in New York make an introduction to our team, and something just really seemed off. And I conducted my initial due diligence, and what I found was that it was a front for a Russian oligarch, and immediately sent that to the enhanced due diligence team, who had the conversation directly with that particular relationship manager, and said, thou shalt not allow any of this person's money into our financial institution. You can imagine I was called a few colorful names, but it really didn't matter. I was doing my job. I hope that people understand that sometimes it's okay to slow things down, but it's always important to put your hands up.
And I think it's important to just add on to that, where is the business coming from? As brokers, we need to ask ourselves that sometimes. So most of our business is either repeat business or referrals, and we can really trace that. So and so you sold his global last month, and I know him from this board or from this whatever. He said I should call you to sell my whatever. People coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, non-referred. I'm not saying they're obviously not everybody is a potential bad actor, but you need to look at that. You need to look at where they're coming from. If you're getting a brand new client out of the blue, I want to work with you, and you can't really understand why, that would be something to explore further as well.
I'd also like to add to, let's not rest on our laurels just because we worked with a client once before and it was amazing. We had an opportunity to work with a client. It was a group of clients again, and I updated the Know Your Customer due diligence, and I found out something very colorful had occurred with one of them. He had turned up as, the only way to describe it, as someone who was keeping a young woman comfortable who was young enough to be his daughter on a national syndicated TV show. And there was the aircraft we were looking to refinance on that show. And, you know, maybe you could have gotten comfortable with it, but I'm sure this gentleman's wife was not comfortable with it. And so it was a risk we had to address with him.
You should write a book, Shelley, with all these stories one day, no?
I know there's a lot of stories that we shared in our prep calls that are not making it here today.
And you're being very gentle on how you're telling the ones that are making it today.
I'm doing my best, Sephora. Keeping it above board for the people at home watching this.
Very good.
I want to reiterate that the people who are members of NAFA are a diverse group of individuals working for amazing companies that support this industry. We have financiers, we have brokers, we have attorneys, and we have other service providers. And I'm hoping that a lot of the title and escrow companies are here today. Trust and truth matters to all of us. And I want to say thank you to you for your time today and in participating in this community, collaborating with all of us together in order to make sure this remains a viable industry with great integrity. And I'm truly pleased to have had this opportunity to get to know Zipporah and Jonathan more.
Likewise here, Jonathan, Shelley, and all the NAFA team, thank you very much. And I think we're open to some questions if anybody has some. I guess we were too clear in our explanations, no?
Yeah, well, I mean, while we're waiting, I mean, I would, because I see it says final remarks. So let me just say, you know, like in my world, I think about risk, and there's no way you can engage in business without some risk. And the whole purpose of the KYC is to reduce that risk. And in 95, 99% of the transactions, it's just an exercise, right? You're getting the information, the other party is giving you all the good information you need. You clear the transaction. I will say in the last 5-7 years, you know, the amount of questions people are asking, the amount of information you're being asked to receive, and the diligence is good. And, you know, so be upfront when you respond quickly, because I've seen KYC be the sort of pacing issue in closing a deal, because you just haven't, somebody isn't responding. They don't think it's important. It is important. But in those 5%, you know, that's when you need to step up and you know, if you can figure it out, figure it out. If not, there's people in the industry that can help. Even if that help is supporting you in saying this deal's a bad idea. I've been the outside counsel that says I don't think you should do this deal, so that the internal pressure on the general counsel isn't, he can use that as the reason not to do a transaction. Anyway, that's my final spiel.
I see a question in the comments here that I'd like to address, and it says, "Can brokers use the KYC from escrow with their clients so we're not duplicating efforts, or is there universal KYC documents?" Thank you, Tom, for asking that. I'd like to share what we do in our firm here is we do have our own KYC form. It is very similar to that used by the main escrow agents that we use. We do it well before we really get involved with escrow, or certainly at the start of a deal at an LOI stage, we'll do a KYC. And then we do advise everybody and we do share it with escrow so to avoid the duplication. We just don't want to, as we've talked about earlier, rely on somebody else's efforts, or B, find out too late in the game that the KYC might not pass. So that's functionally what we do.
And Zipporah's contact information is included in this deck.
So yeah, I see Ed's question there. How can, if an aircraft has been subject to sanctions? So I mean, there are aircraft that have been specifically identified by manufactured serial numbers as being subject to sanctions by OFAC. Similarly, the Department of Commerce has identified by serial number aircraft, mostly commercial aircraft in Russia, but some corporate jets that have engaged in flights in violation of the U.S. export laws, generally flying to Russia, being based in Russia. There's complex rules about foreign airlines flying to Russia and whether they can go there on temporary sojourns. But anyway, but it is difficult in the context of trying to figure out whether a particular aircraft might have been owned at some point by a sanctioned person, because even for very legitimate reasons, we find structures are difficult to discern. Where there may be a trust, there may be a holding company in one country because it's on the San Marino registry, but that's why you need to do the diligence to the best of your ability, and hopefully you would identify whether there's an issue. If you got it wrong, then depending on where you are in the transaction, that would have potential implications. But I would much rather have done the diligence and said, look, we did all this great diligence. There was no evidence that it was ever owned by a sanctioned person, and then have to defend that before the U.S. government. Then we didn't know, but it turns out, well, Gulfstream had stopped supporting this aircraft, 3 years ago, and we should have. Why did they stop?
That's what I was going to add. Is look at the maintenance history. Check for any gaps or red flags in the maintenance history, and look at the flight activity history of that aircraft in addition to the ownership.
And I'd say too, as a financier, don't be afraid to have a conversation with a broker about these issues. We can get so focused on the underwriting aspect. Let's talk about the practical aspect. And what's really amazing about that is you get to know what your partners in the industry are doing. And so you can anticipate asking better questions and learning more about your client and what their needs are.
And not all of us brokers bite. Some of us are okay,
Same thing with attorneys and financiers. We don't bite. Let's see if there's any additional questions or comments. Thank you, Mike Francis, for putting that note in the comments.
Yes.
I was very fortunate to work with Mike. And I'd just like to reiterate this with NAFA, with everyone who's here. Trust really is our brand. and you can reach out and ask us any questions. Like I said, I'm a recovering banker. Before that, I was a recovering federal banking regulator. And in between, I've worked in corporate finance for some very large international firms and also as an investor. One of the things that I do through Infinite Branches, I work with startup businesses as well as high net worth individuals and their family offices. And one of the things I do right off the bat is assess how they are addressing their clients and who they're bringing on board, because an ounce of prevention really is worth everything in the long run. On that note, I'm grateful to everyone who's participated, particularly to NAFA for allowing us to see what happens when a broker, an attorney, and a financier walk into a webinar together to talk about something that does affect all of us.
And let's not make it the last time. Let's
not make it the last time. Remember,
an anomaly.
Communication, collaboration will make us all so much better together.
Thank you so much, everybody.